we're good. We don't need that.
Hello and welcome to our presentation today of Armchair Travels to 13 Presidential Libraries with Sally and Bruce Queen. I'm Quinn Walcott. I'm the Business and Program Manager, and I'm so proud to introduce to you our speakers for today, which are Sally and Bruce Queen. Thank you, and take it away.
Welcome, everyone. I'm Sally Queen.
And I'm Bruce Queen.
And we're here to talk to you today about the 13 presidential libraries that were established as part of the 1955 Presidential Library Act. But first, before we start, hey, Quinn, happy birthday. Everybody wave and give Quinn a happy birthday today.
Happy birthday, Quinn.
I couldn't resist.
Thank you.
So the 1955 Presidential Library and Museum Act established a satellite to the National Archives as part of the National Archives and Resource Administration. And the purpose was to consolidate presidential papers, artifacts, and memorabilia from their time in the presidency at a site of their location. And we have visited all of the 13 presidential libraries, and we're here to take you on a tour of our favorite parts and perhaps inspire you to go visit some of these wonderful resources.
As you can see from the map, the 13 libraries are spread from coast to coast, from Boston, Massachusetts to Los Angeles, California. What we've done is we've grouped them into tours, which you might be able to take on your own and give you an opportunity to see 2 or 3 of them at a time. It took us several years to do that. The first tour we're going to do is the closest library and museum to us, which is the Eisenhower in Abilene, Kansas. And then we'll swing south into Texas to see the 2 Bush libraries and the LBJ library. As we said, the Eisenhower Library is in Abilene, Kansas, which is where President Eisenhower grew up. The library and museum are there. It begins, one of the most interesting things about the Eisenhower Library and museum is that President Eisenhower had a distinguished military career beginning in 1915 and running through the end of World War II. So a substantial part of his museum is dedicated to his military career. He was only president for 8 years out of that time.
And as we went there, this is one of the first ones that we visited. This model you'll see played out with others, and that is to go back to the boyhood home. Now we do have to notice Texans, he was born in Texas. He was born in Denison, Texas, but he grew up in Abilene, Kansas, in a Quaker family. And this is the boyhood home on the right. And as we look back over this tour, we wanted to give you a personal view. And what I remember most about that boyhood home is that he shared a bedroom, 4 brothers in a bedroom, 10 feet by 10 feet. So it's really the model of, from humble beginnings, anyone can rise to the President of the United States.
When we went to the Eisenhower Museum, one of the things we noted, besides the fact that so much of it was dedicated to he and Mrs. Eisenhower's life in the military, was the fact that it was very much old school in its display. It was a lot of posters with reading and interspersed with the artifacts, but you had to go through it and read everything. We understand it's been completely redone, so we may have to start over and go back and see what they've done with the Eisenhower Museum.
The next one takes us to our hometown of Dallas, Texas, and the President George Bush Library, located at Southern Methodist University. So this is the second model of where the president started co-locating their libraries at a university setting. And this we thought was, okay, it's a museum. We were going to take the 3 youngest grandchildren. It was a hot August day, and we thought an hour. It's a museum after all. And we go in, and this is the latest model, and they have really used interactive displays and engaging and TVs and touchscreen maps. And where the grandchildren at that time were aged 10 to 14 were most excited was in this middle picture, the Situation Room. And each person has a role in the government. And one of the grandchildren was the president. And we were given a situation, and we had to discuss it and solve it. And they came out of the room holding their head going, it's hard to be president.
As we went through each of the museums, one of the things that we discussed was which one of the artifacts did we find most memorable or most impressive. At the George W. Bush Museum, that artifact for me was the display that involved September 11th. And the interaction there was to note where you were and log what you were doing when that event happened. In our case, we were living in Washington, D.C., not very far from the Pentagon, so it was quite an emotional moment. Now, you might also note in the lower left-hand corner of this slide some portraits. President Bush has taken up painting since he left the White House, and he had done a complete one-man show of portraits that involved wounded warriors. I was very impressed by the number of paintings that he produced and how fast he was able to do them. And in a connection to one of the other museums, there is currently a display at the Kennedy Museum of portraits that illustrate John Kennedy's book, Portraits in Courage. Another reason to go back to one of the museums. Our next stop was at Austin, Texas, at the Lyndon B. Johnson Library and Museum. Like Eisenhower, LBJ had an extensive political career before he became president. He was elected to Congress in 1937. He was elected to the Senate in 1949, and he became president he became vice president in 1960 and subsequently president. So when you go into the LBJ Museum, what you're going to see is a lot of material addressing his very distinguished political career before he became president. One thing that struck me were so many displays of political cartoons that addressed his career. The one you see there shows the cowboy LBJ leaving the Capitol, walking a tightrope to the White House, carrying the civil rights legislation with him.
And we continue on in our Texas route to who we say affectionately Bush 1. So President Herbert Walker Bush locates his library and museum at College Station at Texas A&M. So all the way down, driving from Dallas to College Station, we discussed why. Why is this museum located here? Why did he choose Texas A&M? And in classic President Bush form, he begins the narration of his introductory film. Please make sure when you go, everybody see the beginning films. It'll set the tone. But he says, you may be wondering why I put my museum and library at Texas A&M, as we had in the car. And he goes on to say that he liked the spirit of the Texas Aggies, particularly on the football field with the 13th player, which they refer to as the fans, the people that cheer them on. He wanted his papers, his artifacts, and his memorabilia to be used, to be seen, to be studied by scholars of all ages. And he liked the spirit of Texas A&M. And he and his wife, Barbara, are buried there at College Station. And what I remember most was that his introductory film really defined him. He just did a great job of setting the tone for our tour.
Now, the second tour grouping takes us to the West Coast. to the Reagan Museum at Simi Valley, California, and to the Nixon Museum in Yorba Linda, California. Both of these library museums are located relatively close to Los Angeles, so it makes for a fairly easy trip between the two. We'll start with the Nixon Museum, and as Sally had said earlier, when we looked at the Eisenhower, Richard Nixon's library and museum are located in Yorba Linda, which was his hometown. They had previously set aside the Sears Craftsman House that his father built the year before he was born, which was on a section of land in Yorba Linda, and then they built the library museum adjacent to it. It's a very somewhat modest museum. It carries an extensive number of papers, of course, because of the interaction that Nixon had with foreign relations. But on the site, the artifact that I found most interesting was they had Marine One, the helicopter that he flew away from the White House in when he resigned the presidency.
And what we saw when we were there were many, many signs that said new exhibit coming, museum being renovated. So I think the message that not only for the presidential libraries, but for all historic sites and museums is that there is change constantly happening as exhibits are prepared, more primary documents are put out, and issues explained. The Nixon, of course, with the ending of his presidency, it took the longest to get his papers and get the library up and running. But we understand it's another one that we'd like to go back and see as they've changed it. But the next day we went on up to Simi Valley and the President Ronald Reagan Museum and Library. They were preparing for a special event because this is a spectacular event center, and they were getting ready for, it looked like dinner for around 200 people. But the exhibits are classic Ronald Reagan. They are, I think Bruce said it best, they're upbeat, they're happy. And what I remember most was the introduction. And he said, "This is the world that I started my presidency with in 1980.
On the slide, of course, is what I considered the most impressive artifact of all the museums. They have the entire 707-based Air Force One in the museum. I did some work with the 707 airplane in the Air Force, and they disassembled the Air Force One, moved it into the museum, and then built that 2.5, 3-story glass wall that you see. Of course, the Reagan Museum has the most impressive site of any of the presidential library museums. It sits on a hill and it overlooks Simi Valley. And as Sally said, it was a joy to tour the place. It was very impressive in all aspects.
It wasn't just enough that they put the Air Force One in there. You got to walk into the Air Force One. You got to experience what it was like to walk up that ladder, turn around and wave to people and have the entire world see your picture. And then you could tour through the airplane. It's not as big as I thought it would be, but it really was you got to experience what it might be like to be the president of the United States or the First Lady.
Our next tour takes us to the East Coast, where you will see the FDR Library and Museum at Hyde Park and the John F. Kennedy Library Museum in Boston, Massachusetts. FDR's Library Museum was the first of the presidential library museums to be assembled. Of course, this was put together after President Roosevelt had died. So you get the impression of a museum that was put together by the people that were near to him and his staff, and it doesn't have the personal touch that some of the other museums have.
Well, that's a really good point. I really found Eleanor's cottage very inspiring, where she would go off to do her writings and her work that she did as the First Lady. But as Bruce said, this was the first one, and it actually was President Roosevelt's concept that he pitched to have these satellites of the National Archives. And it very much consolidates all the papers of our longest serving president, as well as his artifacts. And what's your favorite artifact?
Well, I think the one that strikes most people is the wheelchair, which you can see in the lower slide, or the lower image on the slide. The fact that he was able to conduct an entire presidency of, elected 4 times, and no one was ever really told that he was a sense invalided. It is interesting to note, though, the grandeur of the home that FDR was raised in versus the small homes that some of our other presidents came from. But now we go to the Kennedy Library. And the interesting thing to me about the John F. Kennedy Library and Museum is that it is one of the most impressive buildings. It is sculptural when you approach it, and it has a magnificent site on Boston Harbor. On the other end of that spectrum, however, is the fact that Kennedy had a brief congressional career, a short time as a senator, and then his presidency, which was cut short. So the papers and the archives are not quite as extensive as the other presidential libraries and museums are.
But worth the trip for the architecture alone and its placement on Boston Harbor really defined that Camelot period, which for us was our teenage years and the beginning of awareness of the presidents. So next tour.
And as I said, they currently have a show of George W. Bush's paintings there, illustrating Portraits in Courage, Kennedy's famous book. Now, our 4th tour is a little bit, it's only a single library museum, and that's the Jimmy Carter in Atlanta, Georgia. And as we say, when you die, we don't know if you're going to heaven or hell, but we know you're going to change planes in Atlanta. So take a little break while you're changing planes and run out to the Carter Museum.
It is, like Jimmy Carter, a standalone. He made his as not associated with his boyhood home or with a university, but he wanted to be an educational center in that part of Atlanta. And much of the exhibits are not about the presidency, but about what he has done after the presidency, which is a long and extensive service, and it's ever changing because he and his wife Rosalind are still very, very active. And that part of the museum was the most fascinating part.
You might note over the doorway that it says the center at the Carter Presidential Center. It's very active in hosting conferences, particularly those that involve international diplomacy. Now, Tour 5 covers pretty much the Midwest, from Michigan all the way down to Arkansas. And the first one in this tour is the Gerald R. Ford Museum and the Gerald R. Ford Library. President Ford kind of split the model. He has his museum in Grand Rapids, which was where he was born, and he has his library in Ann Arbor, which is where he went to school at the University of Michigan. We went only to the museum in Grand Rapids.
And what I found fascinating, now we're in our adulthood, so we voted and we know, and this is really an apolitical talk, but here's Ford, someone who takes over the presidency after Nixon's resignation. But it began with Gerald Ford. I didn't know much about him. And the picture of him is what I selected because Gerald Ford Jr. was not born Gerald Ford Jr. His mom was a single mom, and when she married, he was 5 years old, and his stepdad adopted him and changed his name to Gerald R. Ford Jr. And I spent a lot of time at that very beginning of his life because that was just so different than what I expected to see from the President of the United States.
Similar to LBJ, Gerald Ford, President Ford, had an extensive legislative career before he became vice president upon the resignation of Spiro Agnew and subsequent president upon the resignation of Richard Nixon. So a great deal of the museum is dedicated to his early career. But one of the things that's most interesting about Gerald Ford and the Ford family is they have a direct connection to Summit County, Colorado. As some of you know, in fact, most of you may know, the Fords owned a ski house in Vail, and they were avid skiers and spent quite a bit of time in Colorado.
And when you visit in the summertime, please go see the Betty Ford parks and gardens and arboretum in Vail. They are spectacular, and it does bring it home. And they did love this part of the mountains.
Next, we went to the Herbert C. Hoover Library and Museum. Although Hoover predated FDR, FDR had started, or the FDR Museum was built before the Hoover Library and Museum were built. Herbert Hoover had a very distinguished career. He was one of only 3 presidents who were elected that had no prior political or elected office in their resume. He was born in West Branch, Iowa. His father passed away, and then subsequently his mother passed away, and he was put on a train with a lunch and a few dollars and sent to Oregon to be raised by an uncle.
Age 8.
At age 8.
8 years old.
But in the lower right-hand corner, you can see the small cabin where he was born. A lot of people don't realize that he was in the first class at Stanford University, became a mining engineer, became one of the most sought-after mining engineers in the world. He managed mines in Australia, he managed mines in China. He worked extensively in the mining industry and became very wealthy as a result. But he was a very organized person, and he was able to parlay his logistics skills into becoming Secretary of Commerce and then subsequently president. Now, in the lower left-hand corner is the artifact that I was most taken by. My great-grandfather was a blacksmith. Hoover's father was a blacksmith. And so they have a full operating blacksmith shop on the campus at the Hoover Library and Museum.
And Hoover is the president that I knew the least about. And then subsequently learning more and that mining background, he and his wife Lou are also in Leadville's Mining Hall of Fame, and does have a connection to very strong to Summit County. But they did an excellent job of outlining all the good work that he did in various different places. West Branch, Iowa is pretty small, and we use this as one of our trips from Virginia out to Colorado to stop there. And so plan to go with perhaps our next museum.
Maybe a little hard to get there, but it's worth it.
It is.
Now, the next one is the Harry S. Truman Library and Museum, which is in Independence, Missouri. Truman was, for all intents, a modest individual. The house you see on the lower left was the house that he and his wife lived in. It's the house that they left when they came to Washington. It's the house they returned to upon the conclusion of his presidency. I think most people recognize that one of the most significant events in his presidency was the decision to drop the atom bomb and end World War II. But Truman also had quite a challenging presidency when you think about the beginning of the Cold War and the fact that he was president during the Berlin airlift and the rest of the establishment of the Iron Curtain and the start of the Cold War.
And that's what we discovered as we went through these exhibits, that facts that we thought we knew or had been taught in history were given to us from the viewpoint of the president. And Truman was very much an everyday person. And so are the volunteers that work at the museum. And one of them told us a story that a visitor came in and were asking questions about Truman and an event, and the volunteer said, "Well, just 1 minute. Let's go call President Truman, and he can tell you in person." And the visitor went down to the house, which is just down the just down the road from the museum and personally talk to President Truman. And I think that that is what embodies many of these museums and libraries, is that feeling of, I want to tell my story in a different way. And the Truman was just a wonderful experience in getting to know someone that we knew because of the sign in his office. And what that sign say, Bruce?
It's the artifact you'll remember from the Truman Museum, which is the sign that he had on his desk, "The buck stops here." From Truman, we proceeded south to Little Rock, Arkansas, and the William J. Clinton Library and Museum. President Clinton was a Rhodes Scholar and studied law at Oxford, and was impressed by the Oxford Library, which we're told is what he used as the pattern for the archives at the Clinton Museum or Library. We haven't been to the Oxford Library, so we can't speak to that firsthand. But in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the display.
And I mean, I have to admit, as a museum person, this is the last one we went to see. And at this point, I'm evaluating this museum to the other 12. And to be honest, I got tired of reading labels, but it's very, very detailed in all of the accomplishments through his 8-year administration.
Now, as a graduate of the University of Arkansas, which is also where President Clinton did his law studies, and Sally has attended the University of Arkansas, we felt compelled to put a woo pig suey in the middle of this slide. The Clinton Library and Museum, though, does have a direct connection to the state of Colorado. The library overlooks the Arkansas River, and as most of you know, the headwaters of the Arkansas River begin in Colorado.
Many of you may have those personal connections, whether it was the first president you voted for, or whether you heard a speech that had an impact on your life. I did have the opportunity when Clinton was running for president. I was working at Colonial Williamsburg, and he was jogging down the Duke of Gloucester Street. And I knew, and I was walking the dog. It'd been a hard day. And I knew that if I properly called the hogs, as they do at Arkansas, that this man would turn around and talk to me. And I said, all I needed to say was woo pig suey, and he would know that there was somebody that knew the Arkansas call. So our personal connections, I think you will make some of the same as you go through these museums. And we want to take a moment and say thank you to Alpine Bank, who generously sponsored this month of our talks on the presidents. We chose this month because every 4 years we do have a president. Sometimes it's a returning president, and in this case this year, a new president. And it's an opportunity to celebrate in a very public way what makes us American, and that's our right to vote and to be citizens of the United States of America. And we thought that we went through this pretty quickly, and we hope you made some notes about where you want to go, but we'd be happy to take your questions that you might have. So unmute and ask away. No questions?
I had a question. I thought that Hoover's papers were at the Hoover Institute at Stanford University. My audio doesn't work very well. I wrote a message. Hoover's papers, I thought they were at Stanford University.
They may well be. He and his wife Lou lived on the campus at Stanford for a number of years. He ended his life living in New York City. And so I can't give you a direct answer, but I would not be surprised if most of his papers or some of his papers were at Stanford, but they do advertise it as the library and museum. So I might have to do a little more research to give you the right answer to that.
Well, that's a really good question. The Hoover people did go through the process of setting up that formal library and museum. And that was actually in a direct response to FDR spent in his museum the first full room telling you everything that Hoover did wrong. So the Hoover people went back and petitioned to have that be an official library. And that question says, well, does that mean that George Washington's museum and library, which is the formal title of that, would have Washington's papers? Well, the answer is no, because those papers have been scattered throughout both private and public institutions. So it really was a conscious effort with this 1955 Presidential Library Act to consolidate the papers. And I think you just identified Hoover being kind of that cusp of when that was formal. Good question.
So Bruce and Sally, this is probably a question you won't want to answer, but if you were judging the libraries from the thoroughness of the displays and the knowledge you gained, what would be your top 3 libraries that you really enjoyed visiting and learning from?
Okay, you give 1, I'll give 2, you give 3.
Well, let me give you an overview answer to that. Each one of the libraries, again, with the exception of FDR and JFK, show the personal touch of the president of that library. And I would guess the one that I found most interesting was probably Reagan. As Sally and I said, it's an upbeat, it's not overly political, but it's very much reflects the image of the man.
And Steve, I'd have to say that it's Bush too, because the real desire to not just educate in a formal way, but to inform and engage, and just to watch younger children want to be in a museum. I put it at the top of my list for their ability to
Entertainment factor.
well, it was entertainment, but it was also educational.
Yeah.
It was just very well done. And what's 3?
What's 3? Well, I kind of go back to Eisenhower again because of the military connection and what he did. And I'm pretty sure that's the next one we'll go to because we want to see how they've grown from, gosh, what was it, 10 years ago when we went there,
Yeah.
to what it is today.
Well, I think it's a great question because so often we assume, and we hear it here at the Summit Historical Society, they go, we went there 5 years ago, we don't need to go back. So the ever-changing of the artifacts and of what's presented is changing. Yeah. There's a great exhibit, and it's called can't remember exactly, 60 of the 60s. So it was comparing Kennedy and to what's happening today with, say, racial equity. So I think that all of these museums, and every one of them were crowded. There wasn't any one where there were, just a few people there. They were all very well visited.
There really isn't one where we'd say, oh, don't bother to go. They're all worth the trip.
Hey, Steve, have you been to one of the museums? Uh-oh. Did we lose them?
We've been to Bush, Clinton, and Reagan.
Oh, and LBJ.
And LBJ. We're going to drive up to Wisconsin, and we do want to visit Herbert Hoover and hopefully Truman.
Okay.
And
But
Debbie Eisenhower.
I think we've got a goal like you to visit all of them at some point in time.
What's your favorite so far?
Reagan.
Reagan?
Did you go in Air Force One?
Absolutely.
Oh, yeah.
Where's your picture? Did you get a picture?
So actually, I have a picture of Steve behind the podium as president.
Okay, all right, Sandy, that reminds me, at Bush 2, the grandson, the youngest, is sitting at the desk and he signs a bill and he turns and he hands it to his cousin and she says, "Thank you, Madam Vice President." I don't think they have forgotten that moment.
Well, you know, to your point about revisiting the George W. Bush Museum in Dallas, they change out their exhibits periodically, almost every 3 to 6 months, they've got a new exhibit coming in.
Yeah.
So, yeah, people in Dallas go back to that a second, third, fourth time just to see the new exhibits.
Yep. And it's also a reminder with COVID, there are a lot of them that are not physically open. So do check before you go, but they are also going online, much like this. Not that we would compare to that program, but they are doing more online. So check out, you can just type in, say Ronald Reagan, and that'll be the first thing that comes up online.
Sally,
So
Bruce,
So I have two things. Firstly, my birthday is not the only one. This is Quinn Walcott speaking. Sally also has a birthday, which is tomorrow.
And I'll wear the birthday hat tomorrow, Quinn. Thank you.
Secondly, Jean Adams has been so patiently raising her hand and would love to ask her question.
well, I'm being patient because the dogs are barking outside and I'm afraid the neighbors are going to get mad. No, my question is about the libraries themselves. Several of the pictures showed that they had a recreated Oval Office. So do all 13 of them have that or just certain ones?
Yes, they all have that because every president redoes the Oval Office when they take office. And so what you see in the museums is their particular touch on the Oval Office, both colors and drapes and carpets. It's all redone. And we will also, do you have another question, Jean?
Nope, that was it. Thank you.
Okay. There also, we will, for those who may have missed Nancy Smith's talk about the presidential libraries and the Presidential Library Act, we will be putting those up on YouTube. And we just want to say thank you to all of the Summit Historical Society members who have joined us today. And we'll get those up so that you can read them maybe in the middle of the next snowstorm or, you know, when you have time and want to review. It would be really a good overview for you to have listened today and then go back and hear Nancy's talk, which was 2 weeks ago. Any other questions? No, you're all ready to go travel?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Okay.
Thanks, everybody, for joining us. We
Thank
appreciate
you.
Thank you for presenting.
Yes, thank you.
Excellent. Very interesting. Very interesting. Thank you. Happy
Happy
birthday.
Thanks, Sally and Bruce.
Happy
Birthday, Sally, and happy birthday, Quinn.
Happy birthday, Quinn and Sally.
Yeah, you guys did a great job. We really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Great, we're glad you
Awesome.
joined us.
It was very good.
Yes.
Before everybody rings off, join us Friday. Built on Water, interview on the ice castle.
Ah,
Oh,
Yes, please do. Quinn has made special arrangements with the ice castles, which are in our neighborhood. And there are 3 tickets left at $10 on Friday. And so if you're interested, call Quinn tomorrow
be fun.
and book them, or you can go online and book them. Thanks a lot, everyone. Have a good evening.
All right, thank you.